Welcome back to another episode of the Meat Mafia podcast. If this is your first time joining us, we have one goal and one goal only, and that is that you, yes, you, listen to this podcast and get at least one valuable piece of information that inspires you to go radically change your health today. If this is your second, third, fourth, or 100th time listening to the Meat Mafia podcast, we are so grateful to have you, and we are so thankful for your continued support. Before we get going, if you would not mind going and following us on all of our platforms, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and of course, Twitter, we would greatly appreciate it. This just allows us to expand our reach, and your reviews, comments, and feedback give us more and more things to think about and improve the show with. Lastly, this is a user-supported podcast and newsletter, and we would not be able to do what we love doing without your generous support and the support from our sponsors. We take great pride in the relationships that we've built with our sponsors and truly believe that they are the best resources out there for better health. Your support and their support, and you supporting them, means the world to us. If you are enjoying the podcast and getting value out of it, please check us out on the Fountain app below, where you can support us by streaming us sats or sending us support via our Fountain Bitcoin wallet. Without further ado, here is a word from our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by the Carnivore Bar. The Carnivore Bar is a veteran-owned, animal-based company focused on bringing you the highest quality pemmican product on the market. Pemmican is an ancient tradition practiced by American indigenous cultures, and it's focused on simple ingredients: beef, tallow, and salt. It's built for grab-and-go snacking, and it's a great sort of travel, hiking, or school lunch snack. And it's really built for those long-lasting days where you can just run on basically no fuel other than just simple fats. It's rich in saturated fats and provides everything you need to sustain long-lasting energy throughout the busy day. In my opinion, this is a product that is an absolute must, so go check it out in the link below. Also, check out our podcast with the founder, Philip Meese. He does an incredible job breaking down the mission and the passion behind the company. And I think if you're interested in animal-based nutrition, Philip will inspire you with his product. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Holy Cow Beef. Holy Cow Beef is regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef raised right here in Lubbock, Texas. Regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef is the gold standard of beef, and Ann and Weldon Warren have made it their lives' mission to provide incredibly high-quality beef to their local community and beyond. They have been raising their animals this way for decades. In fact, they were some of the most influential voices for getting grass-fed and grass-finished beef in Whole Foods back when Whole Foods was a startup grocery store. They were influential in setting the AGA standards, which is the American Grass-Fed Association, so you know they are doing things the right way, and on top of all of that, their beef tastes like butter. Grass-fed, grass-finished beef provides a superior omega-3 to omega-6 ratio than your typical beef, or in other words, it causes less inflammation in your body. So you are promoting a high-protein, high-fat diet with this amazingly high-quality beef, and saturated fats are playing their critical role in benefiting your body through supporting hormonal functions and cellular functions. And if you're looking for the highest quality beef, look no further than Holy Cow Beef. Leave your butcher box, that Australian and New Zealand raised meat, in the cart and order from your friends Ann and Weldon Warren over at Holy Cow Beef. I almost forgot the most important part there. Ann and Weldon Warren also accept Bitcoin as payment, so go check them out at their website in the link below, and you can pay in Bitcoin or in cash if you're looking to save your Bitcoin. I don't know about you all, but I am all about rewriting the incentives when it comes to healthcare, and CrowdHealth is doing just that. CrowdHealth is essentially crowdfunding for healthcare with a small HSA component mixed in. Paying through the nose for health insurance you may never use, only to be turned away when you actually need it, is incredibly frustrating. Also, the exorbitant costs of health insurance has so many baked in premiums that when you compare settling your doctor's bills by paying in cash versus using insurance, the cost is astronomical. So crowdfunding allows you to settle your medical bills in cash and then get the funding you need from your group through CrowdHealth. This is a great alternative to health insurance for people who are low risk, healthy people who just want peace of mind knowing that if anything actually did happen, they do have a pool of funds to pull from to cover their medical costs. The best part, my group is saving a portion of the monthly opt-in in Bitcoin, and the rest is in cash. So those savings are going towards actually preserving long-term value for my group through a vehicle like Bitcoin. We are really excited about this concept, and since the business model is predicated on an incentive-based healthcare, it is a great concept. For people with low risk, minimal healthcare costs, it is a no-brainer. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code MAFIA for a discount on your first 6 months with Crowd Health. Chloe Sorvino, welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. We're excited to dive into your new book, The Raw Deal, which is getting released December 6th, correct?
Oh, yeah. Hey, thank you so much for having me. Super happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for jumping on. We were saying prior to hitting record that this book really digs into some topics that we're very passionate about. Something we talk a lot about is how you're hearing a lot more about the consolidation in tech and the fear of monopolization, yet there's this whole other kind of almost like quiet centralization that's occurred in the meat and the beef industry, which is something that you cover in your book, The Raw Deal. So I think, Chloe, just as a starting point, I think we just love to learn a little bit more about you and your background and, kind of just what you uncovered, as a writer at Forbes that really prompted you to decide to make this a book.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah. It's so important because I started out doing journalism at Forbes, reporting on wealthy billionaires, figuring out how much they're actually worth for our signature lists. I started out doing that about 9 years ago, and we didn't really have anyone on the food beat. And I was doing a lot of these valuations of people who had either inherited these massive meat packing companies or had carved out a niche in this ever consolidated industry. And what I was really seeing at that point was just a lot of wealth, a lot of power, a lot of consolidation in the hands of such a few small group of people, mostly white men. And it was just startling. And then I started understanding how there are so many different ramifications of that and how that's really played out on every level of the food system and how we eat, how we consume meat specifically, and everything from price to how communities around production are impacted, how workers are impacted, how the soils, if these livestock are grown and raised on, how that's all impacted the waterways surrounding production to everything as big as the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. It's all intertwined, and there are very small few billionaires that have such power to decide how we are fed and how climate change will continue to impact how we are fed going forward.
Was there one story or one kind of person in particular that sort of led you down this path of digging deeper into the food system in particular?
Yeah. So this is the chapter called The Best Steak of My Life, because I was a few years on the billionaire beat, and I had seen and realized that there was just so much consolidation, specifically in the beef industry, which today, depending on the sources you can find, it's the top 4 beef packers have control of 85% of the market. That is a huge amount. The low end, it's 80, but it's just still massive. I mean, when a company has more than 25% of an industry, it's usually a problem for antitrust and it gets regulators' attention. So 85%, massive amount just for 4 companies. And I had realized that the 5th largest meat packer in the beef industry was a relatively tiny percentage, only 2% of the industry, but that 2% was still big enough that, he himself was a billionaire and he had taken over his family's slaughterhouse. I was nearly 100 years old at that point, and he had carved out this niche, been able to kind of maintain this small set in the market, where else all of his other competitors, all the other family-owned companies had been going bankrupt or selling out to these big meat packers that were still there. And, eating away at everything else. And so I went down to Omaha, Nebraska to visit him and visit this slaughterhouse that he had developed. And, slaughterhouses aren't usually very open to having people visit, let alone journalists. But Henry Davis at Greater Omaha Packing really was. And I was just biting at the chance to visit him, see what this is actually all like. And so this whole chapter goes into this very kind of gruesome experience and a very visceral experience of being in this industrial meat slaughterhouse beef that, Temple Grandin had designed way back when. It was actually one of the first slaughterhouses she designed. And, they get a bunch of beef from ranches across Nebraska. They're held in pens that I walked through. They're then brought into the kill room. They're stunned. I mean, it goes on. And I saw all of it. I got rid of my boots from that experience because they were covered in blood and guts. But it was wild because, again, not a lot of people really even just understand that they're able to see that. And I really didn't know what it was going to be like. I didn't know if I was going to not want to eat meat ever again. It was 98-degree heat that day. I was quite worried, but it ended up really not being super smelly. This is a steakhouse supplier. At the end of the day, it's a niche supplier. It's 2% of the industry. A lot of high-end stuff, a lot of stuff that goes to like more chain steakhouses, a lot of USDA prime, even some grass-fed. And so they were doing their best. And at the end of the kind of the main part of the tour, they were so shocked that I wasn't freaked out. And they said, well, usually our guests are puking by now, but since you're not, they'll take you into the feces room if you want. And at that point, I was like, what could the feces room possibly look like? I have to see it. I must see it. It was a lot. There was like guts going around this big turnstile and kind of just getting unstrangled. And I'll never forget the pattern that it kept on going through. But it wasn't as bad as they made it seem. And the real problem with the trip was that when you're on a reporting trip on a company dime, you got to go quickly. So I was like, you gotta get everything in at once. Did the tour, and then later that night, I had a steakhouse dinner planned with the billionaire owner to hear more about everything we had just seen. And when I was planning, I didn't really realize how I really want to eat the steak after. Yeah. But I got there. I didn't know what they were going to bring. They brought steaks literally from the company. They asked me what type of cut I would want. I said, whatever you guys usually would bring. They brought the most gorgeous tomahawks I'd ever seen. And it was the best steak of my life. It was perfect. I can't even begin, but I also had to make sure I ate it. And I really ate it because, it was me sitting at this table in Omaha, Nebraska with 4 other bigger slaughterhouse guys. And the waiter came over to bring us all each of these massive tomahawks with, bones this big, 36 ounces, massive ribeyes. And he gets to me to bring it down, looked at me, looked at the ribeye, looked at me again. I was like, little lady, are you going to be able to finish that? Yeah. And at that point I was challenged. I really had to. And I was the only one at the table that finished. But I did. It was fantastic.
I mean, that makes you an honorary member of the Meat Mafia just after crushing that tomahawk. So
I crushed it. Yeah, I crushed it and everyone was impressed. I had to for my dignity.
That's amazing. Did that experience just getting to actually, tour the slaughterhouse and be that close to death, did that change the way that you view beef and eating beef?
Yeah, I mean, I really do my part to try to source as strictly as possible when I'm eating meat and beef specifically, because there is so much bad meat out there that's really hurting workers, hurting communities, hurting our environment. And I'm really trying really hard to both do only grass-fed and only really local at this point. I try to do it through our partner network, through our CSA. So it's really paying the farmers directly as much as possible, and they're getting as much of that dollar, because there's just a lot of co-opting and a lot of greenwashing. And a lot of venture capital money flowing through like this better for you meat movement and trying to profit off of it, and degrading the product in the process.
Can you talk about some of the implications of 85% of the meatpacking industry being controlled in four large multinational companies' hands, and just what that really does mean? Because I think people hear that and there's obviously a lot of sticker shock. It's a huge number, so few companies, but like, what does that actually translate to for the consumer at the end of the day?
Yeah. So that means that, in some markets where there are ranchers selling beef to the kind of public cash market, sometimes there's only one meat packer or maybe two bidding on that cattle, which means there's really some of the most control you can have. It's essentially monopolization, right? And so even when is competition and there are four meat packers bidding, or four meat packers in a market, four meat packers selling to a different grocer, there's a lot of problems that can happen when there's just so few players and they have an innate fundamental desire or a reason and an incentive to collude. There's been a decade plus now of hundreds of allegations of price fixing in the meatpacking industry. There's been lots of settlements. That's across chicken, that's across pork, and that's across beef. The most settlements have been in chicken. There's been more than 150 to plus, lots more settlements happening. But a lot of companies really, just in chicken alone, but in beef, there's been $54 million in settlements. In pork, there's been tens of millions in settlements. And so there's been actual rulings and actual money going back to consumers who have paid too much for their meat. And so just price is just one way, but that's kind of the clearest way for people. Like a lot of this meat has been actually too expensive because in a lot of markets, there have been alleged allegations of, in different types of collusion or ways that there's been manipulation in uncompetitive markets. And that's also happened because there's been like massive amounts of profits that then have accumulated because there are so few players collecting from so many different, ranchers and contractors that they're now working with. And so like the consolidation of power has led to massive amounts of profits being hoarded by only, again, a few companies that at the end of the day, they all have this actual fundamental, business. A business at the end of the day is a business to make money, and they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to increase their returns, increase what they're bringing back to their shareholders, especially if it's a publicly traded company. And taking all these things together, there's a mismatch of power with who's deciding what meat costs, but also then how the farmers and the ranchers and producers and growers are getting compensated for what they're giving to the meat packers that have kind of amassed so much control and the ability to dictate what the growers are using and how they're doing it and what they're able to do really with their farming.
Yeah, to your point, Chloe, I think you'd mentioned earlier that 85% of all beef is controlled by about four packers, which is just highlighting the centralization of beef. I'm curious, do you find the same centralization to occur in the chicken and pork industries, or is there just something about beef that just lends itself to be more easily monopolized?
So you do have similar trends. Beef is the most pronounced. In pork, it's 70%. And when my book went to press, it was 54%. And after it went to press, there was a merger that was approved by the Department of Justice that had antitrust scrutiny on it. So now it's over 60%. So it's all trending towards beef. Beef was just actually the first sector that became as consolidated. But this is all massive.
Did a lot of these mergers occur in the past 10, 12 years when rates were super low and just cost of capital was really easy to buy companies at pretty cheap valuations?
So beef in particular has been consolidated for a while. A lot of this consolidation started actually 50 plus years ago. It ratcheted up specifically in the 90s in the beef industry. And by the early 2000s, it was super consolidated already. But I will say, one of the parts of my book that I think is just the part not to sleep on, I think, is that, there's been a lot of consolidation that has been driven in the past decade alone, specifically by JBS, the Brazilian meat packer, that's come in and rolled up a lot of companies and become the second top player in the US market in beef, also in pork and chicken in the US, and becoming the biggest meat packer in the world, again, through this consolidation in the US and rolling up a bunch of other companies that had been not rolled up yet, like the last ones really remaining.
Yeah. And the interesting thing with JBS too, Chloe, to your point, and Harry and I wrote a thread on this, is like, we're talking about consolidation and centralization, but like some of these purchases and acquisitions have literally come through fraudulent practices, right? Like I think JBS literally got caught a few years ago. They were bribing one of the largest banks in Brazil, getting favorable loans, which they were then using to, I think they bought Pilgrim's Pride and like one other massive packer. And it's like they're literally funding their business through fraudulent practices, which is insane. And it's like, I know that both of the brothers that were running JBS went to jail for a year. They got whacked with a big fine. But at the end of the day, like the way that they're operating isn't changing. Like they're still putting their beef on the shelves. They're still able to make a massive profit. So we just kind of like selectively let these things go, which is really interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's 2 chapters in my book on JBS. And the first chapter is really going behind the scenes of how all of their bribery schemes and how these bribes really went down. I mean, I'm taking readers through how some of the bribes went down, how one of the billionaire brothers who you're referencing who went to jail, how he was personally bringing cash in a bag to 3 different presidents at different times. And my book is taking you through that. And then my book is also then the next chapter after that is talking about how, again, this consolidation that's been driven to the US has been, there are allegations and issues with how this money and ill-gotten gains, how it was used. And now the problems that they were slapped with fines, as you're saying, not that much in all honesty. The brothers themselves got individual ones as well, violations. They did not serve in the US at all. And, they were removed from the day-to-day, so to speak, but they're still top shareholders. Their family is still very much, the largest shareholder running. They have a lot of different family members in key positions. And, even actually just today in New York City, the Batista brothers family investment vehicle, JNF, was one of the sponsors of this big Brazilian development conference that one of the former presidents was speaking at. And so, they're still very much involved. They're still driving the day-to-day of the meat industry in the US. And there's a lot of ramifications for that in terms of the US school public lunch program, the network of ranchers and growers in the US that JBS works with every day. There's a lot at stake and a lot of workers too.
Yeah, this idea of centralized control of any industry is particularly concerning when it comes to being able to gain political favor, and I think that clearly JBS has done that in Brazil. But I'm curious how that how that plays out in the US, because there's a lot of labeling laws that I think would favor some of these bigger packers and actually be disadvantageous to smaller packers. So is there anything that you came across that sort of speaks to that, where, hey, like the big guys are really getting exactly what they asked for when it comes to, political power and political sway?
Yes, I mentioned the public school system very briefly, but I'll say that they're still continuing to get hundreds of millions of dollars in US contracts. Still also, being supported by a lot of subsidies directly and indirectly. But in terms of the school lunches, they even had one of their biggest contracts, a multi-million-dollar contract, signed on the day that recording that Joesley Batista had, gotten leaked, and that kind of indicted and incriminated one of the former presidents and kind of saved their own skin in some ways. One of the U.S. public school lunch contracts for many millions was signed the day that leaked, that aired, that went viral around the world. And they've continued to get a lot of other contracts since this has all, again, been discovered, been illuminated. People are turning an eye, and especially in Washington, they have a lot of lobbyist friends in Washington. They also have a lot of folks in the revolving door, big names that, we'd all recognize, who have joined different advisory groups of theirs or boards or different organizations who are lobbying for them.
Interesting. One of the other interesting things that we had come across when we were just researching the consolidation in the beef industry prior to this is just some of the investments that they've been making in their space, particularly in the fake meat space, which is interesting because you're like, all right, these are beef companies, they're meat companies. Wouldn't they be advocating for pure animal protein? But I have something in front of me right now. It says that Tyson has made 6 investments in the fake meat space. Cargill has 4, JBS has 4, and Smithfield has 1. So I'm just curious, like, your thoughts there, because when I look at this, I'm thinking to myself, okay, it's not really about pure animal protein. It's more so just about profit. And I'm curious if you think that that's what they're doing, or maybe they have a different take on it. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think they're both following the money, following the profit, but also there's another side to it too, where they can control what they can, especially easier if it's earlier on. And they can control and keep it smaller in some ways. I've talked to a lot of the big meat packers that have been investing, from Tyson to JBS, in plant-based, and they say it will grow, but it'll be a very small subset of their sales, and that, meat demand will continue. They're never saying with these investments that meat is going to not have increasing demand. They're saying it's just kind of going to grow with that demand. But interestingly, in the case of JBS, and my book actually points to this, and it accelerated even since then. There's actually even more news that they actually recently shut down their U.S. plant-based division. So they started it 2 years ago, invested a lot of money into it, kind of blew up a market, got on the shelf of 2,000 stores, and push a lot of other competitors that weren't as well funded with JBS billionaire dollars, backing them to get on the shelf. They got on a lot of Kroger, a lot of else, and now they're deciding it hasn't worked out for them and calling it quits, taking the line. They also invested $400 million in the second largest European brand for plant-based, and that's going to continue. But in the US, it seems like they've totally scrapped their efforts. And I think it really speaks to, if there actually aren't good intentions behind some of these investments, these things can just be written off and can put tomorrow. And that's just a lot of time and resources and energy wasted on something, when there really needs just to be a lot of capital going towards solutions that are going to protect us against climate change getting worse.
Equip's unflavored prime has one single ingredient derived directly from grass-fed beef protein. For purists like ourselves who try to only consume balanced, real sources of nutrition, this protein powder checks all the boxes. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code in the description to get a discount. And what might some of those be? I know you mentioned some more like small, local, grass-fed operations, supporting local farmers. Do these big packers have any sort of incentives to support that type of system?
Yeah, well, also speaking to the point, JBS playing all sides of the game. JBS actually one of the biggest grass-fed producers in the country as well. And they're definitely the biggest grass-fed producer, top 4. But there's also a lot of greenwashing with grass-fed. There's a lot of confinement happening now with grass-fed, cattle eating grass pellets, not really actually in the open range or on pasture, going around to different parts and grazing, which is super important for the actual soils. But there are, a lot of farms that are trying to do this in again, an adaptive grazing sort of system that actually is scientifically proven to work. And this can be a part of the farm of the future. But I think what's more important really is for regional food systems to be better supported from an infrastructure perspective, rerouting a lot of the subsidies that are going towards harmful chemical production of corn and soy that's polluting waterways and having a lot of really bad, harmful negative impacts. And I think also at the end of the day, I think, well, consumers need to understand that voting with your dollar is a false messiah, that if we're very smart about how we use our dollars, it can be felt easier, or if it can be felt more, it can actually go towards helping the system and feeding a better food system. But I think, you have to think about all the different hands that are touching that dollar at the end of the day. And also, we're in the system where there's so much venture capital money and investor money that's making crazy valuations, making crazy expectations, and putting a lot of pressure on different companies that wouldn't necessarily have to be there otherwise. And, I think getting away from supporting companies that, there needs to be a 3 to 5 times return on this investment for this investor in 3 to 5 years, or else they're, going to be very mad. I think those are the types of things that distract. And, supporting, a CSA, supporting a meat CSA, supporting a local food hub that is directly going to, a farmer and a system that they're paying into is super important.
It's even interesting to hear you use the terms 3 to 5 times multiple when talking about food, because that's like how you would talk about a technology company or a venture capital firm, looking at a company that they would want to invest in. So, and it seems like with a lot of these fake meat companies that are popping up, that is definitely the trend where they're even getting executives from technology companies to run them. Do you find that like convergence of like kind of running it like a tech company only to be in the fake meat space? Or do you think with these like big meat companies, that's also the mindset that they have as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to remember like the perspective I come at this from. I started out at Forbes as like the billionaire valuation reporter for a lot of these food billionaires. So I was doing like a Tyson valuation and a Cargill valuation, but I was also doing the valuation of what those billionaires were investing in themselves as well. And, at the same time, then I was also, doing the 30 under 30 and seeing how so many young folks were starting new companies, getting these absurd valuations, getting a lot of equity taken off the table and getting things like liquidation preferences and other things thrown at them they didn't really understand. And just like seeing how that's then boomed so much. And I'm one of the few journalists who covers this from this perspective of climate and food and farming, but also tech, because and there's 3 chapters in my book about the alternative protein stuff and how the finance is really kind of ruining this potential movement in some ways. And it really kind of gets kind of like a major thesis I have just from, my 10 years of reporting on this, but I'll boil it down to that. Essentially, you've had a bunch of years where there was like no money flowing into food. Maybe 1 or 2 investment firms here or there. And they knew that like food was a long-term business and something that you weren't going to get sold for a huge amount, but that, it was going to be steady. So they'd expect, a 2 to 3 times return. And then we had a few kind of bigger sales happening, a few kind of bigger acquisitions by Unilever and, Beyond Meat going public at this crazy, crazy number. People got really excited. And then there were a lot of tech funds that had rolled over after 3 to 5 years. A typical venture capital investor, expects to exit a business in 3 to 5 years. And so, in 3 to 5 years that those funds had rolled over, they had new money and they were like, oh, we just invested in all these SaaS companies. We all just invested in all these different cloud, and oh, it looks like the future of food is untouched. And I can't tell you how many different investors told me about how it's the early days of the internet. Feels like the early days of the internet again. And, they were just kind of looking for that next hit. And, so they started investing into food companies, and alternative protein got the most. Became the biggest of this boom, but it happened everywhere. But alternative protein really got the biggest valuations, the biggest multiples. And so then all of a sudden, these investors started understanding they were investing in a more competitive space and it was riskier. They were getting maybe 0 times returns way more often, but they were also getting like that 10-time return. And that's what they were searching for. And so it attracted a lot of copycats, a lot of hangers on, and a lot of funds that thought they could like maybe get lucky, essentially. And it really, helped blow up a market. And now this market for alternative proteins from, monocrops, commodities is really kind of at a standstill. And it's lifeless. But
what sort of investment thesis were these investors being sold? Like, was it truly at its core an environmental play? Was it that you're going to get a higher quality protein, or was it that this is going to be a product that you can patent and then protect? You'll have protected patents into the future to be able to continue to iterate on this product, or some combination of all three of those?
Absolutely. It is a total patent game. It's an intellectual property game. I think that's what irks me and like frightens me the most in some ways, particularly when you're talking about lab grown, cultivated meat, whatever you want to call it. That I think is a bunch of investors, a lot of billionaires saying we have a chance to own a piece of one of potentially the biggest parts of how people will eat food in the future. And that's why the control, the power, the consolidation of power, and how they have money to invest in the first place is so important, because that's the power to dictate what we're eating. When are we going to be in the matrix with the amino slop? I'm not sure, but there is a lab grown company out there that thinks that could happen, and there's a billionaire funding that, and also in some ways, and also changing the market and making the market for investment into these companies have an even higher bar than they should. There was one story in my book, not from a lab grown company, just an alternative protein, like a plant-based company. And they got a series investment round and closed it from a billionaire backed firm, and got also, by the way, counter offer on this investment deal too, that valued them at over $1 billion. They got the offer, got the counter, and closed it within 15 minutes, because that's just how hot the alternative protein market was at a certain point in time, and how much expectation there was, and how much just like desire there was to get in on these crazy deals. So, I think the intellectual property, it is, yeah, it's pretty nuts. That's one of like that's in the book. I think there's just a lot to think about and contend with a very small group of people owning not just the keys to production, like is currently in the meat industry, but also the actual how to make it, how to cultivate it. And it is such a technified process, something that's not natural. I think there's huge questions for me with that.
Yeah, I think a really good model, simple model for nutrition is if the company has a chief science officer, I don't know if you should be ingesting that food. That's just the thesis that I have. I don't know if anyone else agrees with that, but it is interesting. I know you mentioned that you're in New York. I lived in New York for a few years, but any, large metropolitan city, particularly, with like the millennial demographic, it's almost like you've been sold a false bag, where I have so many friends that are avoiding dairy because they've been told that it's particularly harmful for them, and they're opting for almond milks or oat milks. And it's like, just because you label something milk doesn't actually make it milk, right? If it doesn't come from a mammal, it's really not milk. And they're being sold this because these companies have massive marketing budgets, and they're able to pump, different statistics on nutrition and cherry pick data. And it's really concerning, because I think a lot of people are nutrient making the right decision for their own bodies and the environment. And it seems to be, contrary to the case. So it's just, it's just fascinating to hear you unpack all this stuff, because I think it's just, there's statistics that just need to be told.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate it. I was going to have a whole chapter even just on the nutrition of these plant-based products, and I ended up wrapping it all into one, because, there's too many things to talk about. But I will say that it's shocking what goes into these things. And in general, nothing ultra processed is going to ever be healthy for you. Nothing, grown with chemicals, sometimes even potentially harmful or cancerous chemicals, can possibly be healthy for you. And nothing's good for the soil when it's monocropped to shit. And, I think we just really have to think hard and long about like what's going into these products, and then also then how they're produced, and then how they're able to stay so shelf stable to begin with. But there's crazy things in there. I mean, there's like the common, cellulose that's used as a common laxative is even in, Beyond and Impossible. And that's just like one of like the more innocuous ingredients,
Yeah. Yeah. So when we're looking at the choices that are available to us, right? It's like, it's not big beef. It's not big meat. It's not fake meat. So do you, like in your book, do you get into what the solution actually is? And is that just connecting with your local farmer?
Yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be an element of scale, because the book also talks about how it's just a massive disappointment that the past decade of talking about local food systems and locavorisms and farm to table movements that's just gotten completely co-opted. And at the same time, it's so ubiquitous in everyone's minds, and yet it's still only like 1.5% of total output, and it's not made a dent. And we need scale. We need to make a dent, because like time is running out to make these like really important changes. And so, well, I think there's a combination of things. I think you have to find a farm that feels good to you. You have to find one that's really going the extra distance to test and to figure out how they are impacting their ecosystem surrounding them entirely, from workers, community, environment, soil, water, air, all of it. I'm a big fan of a few in the local area. I worked at independent slaughter actually for the book in 2020. A friend from Stone Barns actually left and worked at this new farm, Cartersville Farm, that supports soup kitchens and almost the entirety of what they produce. And it's not just meat, but they have mushrooms in the forest. They have lots of different produce. I was invited to work. I worked a slaughter with them for 2 days, and it was 100 chickens. It was very intense, but they have a very small farm store. 10% of it you can buy. Operations like that I love supporting. I'm toying with the idea of becoming a member of the Maui Nui Hunted Venison Box. It's a question for me because of like the emissions with flights and travel, right? But I think what they're doing is incredible. How rare to be supporting something that, while it has like generations of cultural significance, it is technically an invasive animal. They're hunting it at night in the field. They have this like crazy like CrossFit trainer group of folks who are running into the fields and shooting them, getting them into their mobile slaughterhouses immediately, and doing it all as a USDA approved system. One of the only ways that you can really eat like hunted meat commercially. And the product is just delicious. It tastes fantastic, and it really has the phytonutrients that are so important to ingest. So I don't know. I go back and forth about those sorts of things, but those are some of the types of companies that and systems, financial systems that I'm trying to support, because I think it's really about the systems of production is just as much as it is about the individual companies or individual farms, because we're only going to get like that scale and change with supporting a system.
Mm. And Chloe, you mentioned voting with your dollar previously, but then you also said voting with your dollar is a false messiah. And I'm kind of curious what you meant by that, because I think it's something that we talk about a lot is just like putting your money where your mouth is and try to support those systems. But it can seem tough at times or somewhat hard to really measure like what sort of impact you're actually making. So curious what you meant by that, and just like if you could unpack it a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So I think I kind of talked about venture capital too in the alternative protein context, but like let's talk about it from like the grass-fed beef context, because I think there's a lot of investors also that are trying to, rightfully so, give capital to systems that need to help scale. And there is some interesting stuff that are happening. Like, I'm sure your audience knows ButcherBox. Mm-hmm. They have they're B Corp, they have a lot of good things that they're doing, but at the same time, they are, giving free boxes of bacon or lots of different pounds of meat for free. And I think that's because they're driven by, unfortunately, probably trying to grow their customer list, make an acquisition happen. There's a lot of venture capital money that's just going into customer acquisition and ads on Instagram. And then that's making it very hard then for your local farmer to then break through the Instagram noise if they're just using this investment capital that's then, kind of taking up space when it might not even really exist in a few years, So I think it's really tough to figure out like how many layers of people are profiting off of your dollar, but that's the most important aspect to try to figure out. And, that's why, and I kind of go a little hard in the book, honestly, on farmers markets, because farmers markets are not financially sustainable for the farmer. They're not really financially sustainable for the workers. A lot of the workers there are not getting overtime. A lot of them don't have health care. And the farmers themselves, often even before the pandemic, weren't making money off of this, the logistics, the amount just to travel. Maybe foot traffic wasn't even there to begin with. It's super difficult. And so I think you have to, everyone has to buy food. Everyone has to provide for themselves. And we have to choose at the end of the day where that goes. Grocery stores are always going to be supporting those big four top meat producers, because grocery stores themselves are super consolidated, and they will only work with those top bigger people because they don't have the bandwidth to support anyone else. When you get to like the smaller, direct to consumer companies, you could be getting somewhere where it's like, getting direct. That's better for your dollar, right? But at the same time, then maybe it's one of those ones that is, backed by a bunch of investors, and maybe that's not the best. Is it backed by Jeff Bezos? Is it backed by a billionaire? Is it backed by Bill Gates? I think those are the types of questions that I wish labels did a better job of helping people understand, instead of just having a cartoon of a farmer or a chicken on their labels. But I think, it's a problem because, there's a certain level of privilege just to do the education and to do the research to figure out what is this company and who's profiting off of it. And, that's a shame. But I think the more we are, supporting things that are rooted in community, like a CSA that all members will work at usually a shift for, or a co-op grocery store, I think those are super easy ways just to take one step and make a difference.
Yeah, there's almost like this juxtaposition with ButcherBox, where on one hand, you can look at it as like, yeah, they're venture backed, they're raising money, they're trying to grow their email list, but they are getting people to eat grass-fed beef, if it actually is. But then the counter argument to what you're bringing up is like, well, the more that they grow, they're just taking business away from the small local farmer that you could be giving your business to. And I have also heard, I don't remember who the source is, but I've heard that ButcherBox gets a lot of their stuff overseas. So you're not even getting meat that's grown or processed in the US, which is
there's a lot of that. Thrive Market too, for a while, at least I know, was getting a lot of their grass-fed beef from Chile. I think especially when you get into the grass-fed beef side of things, almost all of it is coming from South America because there's more testing there. Some of the better stuff is coming from Australia and New Zealand, but a lot of it's coming from South America. And there are questions, emissions-wise and otherwise.
Is it your opinion, or do you think that our global food system should rethink the idea of a global food system? I was in Costa Rica a few months back, and there was like blueberries from California, and I'm like, this is weird. Like, I wouldn't have expected that. And so, I just think there's a lot of kind of like privilege in like this idea that like food will just always be there no matter the season. And maybe it's something that we should reconsider for the durability of the food system and also the longevity of it. And just like the product at the end of the day is better for the end user if it's local and, grown by someone who's really putting their heart and soul into it. And the incentives are really supporting them providing the highest quality food.
Yeah, I think there's, kind of a twofold answer to that. I think, unfortunately, we just don't have enough time to start from scratch. Climate change is here. It's very real. It's very happening already. And it's impacting how food and meat is raised to begin with. And so the consolidation is unfortunately going to be kind of here to stay unless there's like a major unwinding that happens. And there's just a lot of assets that big meat has that eventually need to be repurposed and changed and completely restructured. But they have a workforce, they have lots of infrastructure, they have lots of sales teams and sales reps out there. That's just infrastructure that I don't really see changing quick enough in the next 5 years, because we pretty much have like 5 years to try to counteract and decarbonize as much as possible. And so there's that level. I think what they have to do is significant reforms, major overhaul. But also at another level, infrastructure on the regional level really has to change, because when crisis hits, it hits local. And I think there'll be a lot of crises happening at once. And it's going to be up to communities to really make sure that every single person is supported in those emergency and long-term displacement situations, which will be happening. And I say every single person because I think institutions and the global commodity system for decades has prioritized some people and not others. And we can see that in every aspect of honestly what we're dealing with today. And I don't trust that to change, especially not quick enough for what we need it to happen.
Have you come across any compelling information, Chloe, that makes you think that regenerative agriculture is possible to be implemented at scale?
Yeah, absolutely. White oak pastures, I think, is an absolutely incredible example of a system that you probably couldn't replicate in a bunch of different places, but there is a certain level of scale even in that system. And I think they prove that our hooves are needed to regenerate degraded cropland. There's nothing else that's going to be able to do it for some specific environments. And you can do it in this amazing way. And they have the numbers to prove it. I mean, I think there's long-term questions around how much carbon really does actually stay in the soil. So in terms of carbon credits and offsets, I think you get a little hairy there. And I've got a lot of questions myself. But in terms of how these systems can support a local community, rehabilitate soil, grow food for people that's healthy, nutritious, good for the community around it, I think you have no question there that it absolutely can be done.
One of the things that Will Harris talks about on his blog, he's the owner of White Oak Pastures. He talks about the idea of not just focusing on carbon as being the only benefit of regenerative agriculture, because it does then lend itself to becoming captured by regulation. And then we start losing focus on all of the other benefits in terms of building habitats back, restoring water infiltration back into the soil, and all these other positive externalities that happen when you start doing what nature really is intended to do and with these animals. So I'm curious, how do you kind of unpack that from a perspective of, we do want to be thinking about carbon sequestration, but there's also all these other positive impacts, especially the water one. I think that one's really important.
Absolutely. Water is huge. I think I could talk for hours about water, but I'll put that aside for a second just to say that, that's why I kind of led into how I did. And I appreciate this question because there will be systems that industrial chemical farming has even degraded so much beyond the point of recognition that truly no other system will be able to help. And adaptive grazing is the only multi-paddock adaptive grazing is the only way to regenerate those soils. And again, I think there's a lot of investors, a lot of regulators who are trying to kind of co-opt and commodify carbon. And it gets completely distracting because at the end of the day, the water systems alone that support production, but also support our food systems. I mean, it just goes back to the local communities surrounding, the systems of production. White Oak Pastures is in Bluffton, Georgia, really small town. And, they've been able to, feed their community and also bring this meat around the world. But, he's taken over a lot of different land in that county over the years as he's proved his process to be working. And this was land that was mostly peanut, I believe, peanut cropland that was just completely degraded, and no one was trying to solve it and fix it and make it actually, help and be productive. And so I think, there's a certain risk in putting too much weight behind carbon, and there's also a certain risk in putting too much weight behind any solution, including a regenerative system. I think there has to be a lot of clear definitions for how regenerative is done. But if you're talking about how Will Harris does it at White Oak, I mean, there's too many externalities in how industrial production has been harming our environment and soil and just creating massive biodiversity loss. Creating dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, killing manatees in Florida, even through algae blooms. there's just so many different ramifications. That's one of the most humbling things that I learned is from just going down the rabbit hole from doing this research is truly just the amount of that how industrial meatpacking impacts every single aspect of our day.
Mm-hmm. In all the research that you've done, putting together the raw deal, is there a chapter that sticks out that is either like your favorite or makes you the most proud? And then also like the chapter that was just the most difficult for you to write?
I've talked about a few of them, but I'll say I felt the most perseverance while writing the first JBS chapter because I was truly going through thousands of pages of lawsuits and settlements and indictments and, attorney general testimony interviews and just crazy documents and crazy legalese that I went down the JBS fever dream and came back after a few months and just laid it all out there because just the stories of each bribe themselves were wild and I needed to take time with them. I also will say that, the conclusion for me was really important because I wanted there to be this sense of addressing what's happening and addressing potential solutions, but not being overly optimistic. It starts off with an anecdote about bison and bison always, embracing the storm, not turning away from a storm and walking towards it and because they know they'll get out of it at a certain point. And I think that was a really powerful image that has helped me, again, not have too much optimism, but have hope, because I do think if we can collectively strengthen communities and strengthen how our food is delivered through communities, that like we will be able to get through it, but only if it's really as a pack together. So I'll say those two.
Mm-hmm. So you do find yourself hopeful when you think about the future of the food system and society?
I want to be hopeful. I have hope for certain folks who are doing good work. I don't know if they'll get drowned out at a certain point, and I do hope they don't. I want to be realistic, but I have to have a little optimism.
Hey, forced optimism is still optimism, so we'll take it.
Yeah, I hear that.
Is there any one singular message that you wanted people to know before they read the book, or just as they put the book down, like, note from the author in terms of what they should be thinking about?
Yeah. Time is running out. Climate change is going to make it so much harder to eat food, especially food that we love. And the meat industry has to completely change.
Mm.
There you go. Powerful.
Good note to end on.
Yeah. And Chloe, for people that are interested in, whose message has really resonated with them, what's the best way for them to go about purchasing the book?
Local independent, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. It's Raw Deal, Hidden Corruption, Corporate Greed, and the Fight for the Future of Meat. It's out December 6th with Atria Books. It'll be pretty much everywhere books are sold. There's audiobooks, Kindle, you name it. Super excited to get it out there.
Awesome. Well, we're super excited for you, and we appreciate you coming on the show and, sharing this really important message. And we're excited for it to just go live and just see it have an amazing impact. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I so appreciate it. This was awesome. I love that you guys asked about JBS and climate and everything in between. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Chloe.